It was late October, and the wind carried the kind of chill that seeped into bones. The leaves had already browned, crackling underfoot like whispers from the dead. No one spoke of the stories that clawed at the edges of reality, the ones told in hushed voices over campfires and inside dimly lit bars. These were the stories that never made it to the news, too disturbing to be acknowledged by the sane. But they happened, and once you heard them, you couldn't unhear them. A woman named Claire was driving alone down an old country road in Missouri, where the trees arched over forming a tunnel of darkness. Her GPS had died an hour ago, and her phone had no signal. She had seen the same twisted oak tree 3 times now. Panic set in. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw a figure standing in the woods, a tall man, dressed in an old-fashioned suit, his face blank like a mannequin's. Her headlights flickered, and for a moment he seemed closer. She stepped on the gas, heart hammering. A mile later, she saw headlights in her rearview mirror, an old truck, its grille rusted, headlights dim. The truck kept pace with her no matter how fast she went. Then the honking started. Long, blaring honks. She glanced back and saw a shape in her back seat, a man with hollow eyes, smiling too wide. The truck veered close, nearly hitting her. She screamed, swerving off the road, her car landing in a ditch. When she looked up, the truck was gone. So was the figure in her back seat. The next morning, a farmer found her wandering along the road, dazed. The police knew the story all too well. It had happened before. In a small Indiana town, a man named Greg moved into an old rental home with his wife and daughter. The previous tenant had left everything behind: furniture, clothing, even half-eaten meals. Greg shrugged it off. People left in a hurry sometimes. But then the noises started, the shuffling at night, the low whispers in the hallway. One night he found his daughter standing in the living room, staring at the darkened corner. "He's watching," she said. Greg turned on every light, but no one was there. Days later, while moving furniture in the basement, he found a hidden door. Its handle rusted shut. With effort, he pried it open. The stench hit him first, rotting, putrid. His flashlight revealed a small room lined with mattresses and chains bolted into the walls. In the center, a stained rocking chair sat still, though Greg could have sworn he saw it move. The moment he backed away, the door slammed shut on its own. That night, he woke to his daughter screaming. Her closet door was wide open. Her bed was empty. His wife sobbed, pointing to the corner. The rocking chair sat there, slowly creaking. In it, their daughter, her eyes wide and unblinking. She was breathing, but wouldn't speak, wouldn't move. When they tried to touch her, the lights flickered violently, and the air turned freezing. They fled the house that night, never looking back. Days later, the landlord admitted the last tenant had gone missing, along with 2 other families before them. The police never found anything, but locals whispered about the man who built the house, how he liked to keep his guests from leaving. In the Appalachian Mountains, hikers spoke of the faceless ones. Late at night, campers reported hearing footsteps circling their tents. If they peeked outside, they'd see people standing at the tree line, still, silent, their heads tilted unnaturally. They had no faces, just smooth, pale skin. If you ran, they followed. If you ignored them, they watched. No one knew what happened to those who stared too long. A group of college students dared each other to camp in the mountains. They laughed at the stories, dismissing them as folklore. But that night, the laughter stopped. Around 3 a.m., the footsteps came. The students huddled inside their tent, whispering. Then came the tapping, fingers against the nylon, slow and deliberate. One of them, a guy named Jordan, grabbed a flashlight and unzipped the tent. The beam caught a glimpse of something just outside. A figure, featureless, standing inches away, its head tilted as if listening. Jordan stumbled back, screaming. The tent collapsed in the chaos. When they scrambled out, the figures were gone. The only sign of them was a single footprint in the dirt. Too long, too narrow, and leading into the trees. They left everything behind and ran for miles. When they finally reached town, exhausted and terrified, an old man at the gas station only nodded. "You're lucky you didn't look 'em in the eyes," he muttered. They never returned to those mountains. Then there was the truck stop along Route 66, where truckers spoke in low voices about the girl in the blue dress. She appeared late at night, walking along the highway, her bare feet dirty. If you pulled over to help, she'd get in, never speaking, just staring out the window. Some truckers swore they dropped her off at a motel, only to see her again miles down the road. still walking. One driver, an old-timer named Ray, picked her up one rainy night. He tried making conversation, but she stayed silent. When he glanced at her through the mirror, she wasn't wet. Her dress was dry, despite the storm. His gut tightened. Something wasn't right. He asked her where she was going. She finally turned to face him, and he nearly drove off the road. Her eyes were black voids, her mouth stretching into an unnatural grin. She whispered something he couldn't understand, her voice layered with others as if 100 people spoke at once. Ray slammed the brakes. The girl vanished. But his radio crackled, and through the static, her voice came through, whispering his name. He quit trucking the next day. Some stories had no explanation, no closure. A man named Travis rented a secluded Airbnb in Arizona looking for a quiet getaway. The listing was normal, cozy cabin, scenic views. But the host had one strange rule: never leave the door unlocked after midnight. Travis shrugged it off. That first night, he heard scratching at the windows. The next, a low knock at the door around 2 a.m. Peering through the peephole, he saw nothing, but the knocking continued. He checked his phone. No signal. The clock blinked 3:15 a.m. when he finally fell asleep. The third night, he forgot to lock the door. At exactly 12:01 a.m., the door creaked open. Something shuffled inside. His breath hitched. In the darkness, he heard slow, deliberate breathing. His fingers trembled as he reached for his flashlight. When he flicked it on, the room was empty, but the door was wide open. The next morning, he packed and left, texting the host about what happened. She replied with a single message: "You're lucky. The last guest never left." There were countless stories like these, whispered from town to town, warnings for those who wandered too far into the unknown. Some people never believed them. Others never got the chance to, because once you saw something you weren't meant to see, it stayed with you forever.
Story number 2.
The road stretched endlessly through the Arizona desert, a black ribbon cutting through miles of barren land. Nathan had been driving for hours, his fingers tight on the wheel, the silence of the night pressing against his ears. His GPS had lost signal an hour ago, and the last gas station he passed was boarded up, long abandoned. His tank was half full, but he didn't like the idea of being stranded out here. The wind picked up, whistling through the cracks in his windows. The air was thick with the scent of dust and something else, something foul, like rotting meat left in the sun too long. He wrinkled his nose and turned up the radio, but it only crackled with static. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, nothing but darkness behind him. Then, in the distance, headlights appeared. A pair of them, glowing faintly against the empty road. He exhaled, relieved. Another driver, maybe even a trucker. The headlights grew closer, but something about them unsettled him. They were uneven, one light slightly lower than the other, as if the vehicle was damaged. He watched the glow in his mirror, expecting the car to speed past. But it didn't. It stayed back, trailing him at a distance. Nathan kept driving, ignoring the anxiety creeping up his spine. It was probably just another traveler, someone else lost in this godforsaken stretch of road. But when he glanced back again, the headlights were closer. Too close. A horn blared. Long. Hollow. Wrong. Nathan's hands clenched the wheel. The sound wasn't like any horn he'd ever heard before. It was distorted, almost human, like a scream trapped inside metal. His stomach twisted as he tapped the brakes, hoping the car would just pass him. Instead, the headlights flickered. Then they vanished. Nathan's breath caught in his throat. The road behind him was empty. No lights. No car. Nothing. His pulse hammered in his ears. Had the driver turned off their headlights? Had they pulled over? He slowed down slightly, peering into the darkness. A shape loomed in the road ahead. He barely had time to react before he swerved, tires screeching against the pavement. The car skidded, the back end fishtailing as he struggled to regain control. The moment he stopped, his breath came in ragged gasps. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it might crack his ribs. He turned his head, his headlights illuminating the figure he had nearly hit. A woman. She stood in the middle of the road, barefoot, her dress tattered and clinging to her thin frame. Her long, tangled hair obscured most of her face, but what he could see was pale, almost colorless. Her hands hung limply at her sides, fingers twitching slightly. Nathan swallowed hard, his mouth dry. Every instinct screamed at him to hit the gas, but his body refused to move. The woman tilted her head, her body swaying slightly as if she wasn't entirely there. Then she took a step forward. Nathan's breath hitched. He reached for his phone, but his hands trembled so badly he could barely unlock it. No service. Of course, another step. His headlights flickered. For a second, just a second, he swore he saw something behind her. A shape. Tall, thin, with arms too long and fingers like needles. It crouched behind her, its head twisting unnaturally as if watching him. Then the lights returned to normal and the thing was gone. Nathan's body finally reacted. He threw the car into reverse, the tires screeching as he backed away. But as he did, the woman's mouth opened. Her jaw unhinged. A guttural wail filled the night, piercing, inhuman. The sound rattled his bones, made his vision blur at the edges. He pressed his hands to his ears, but it was inside him now, clawing through his skull. The rear tires hit something, maybe a rock, maybe a dip in the road. The car jolted violently, and for a horrifying moment he lost control. The world spun as the car veered off the road, skidding onto the dirt shoulder. The engine sputtered, then died. Silence. Nathan's chest rose and fell in rapid bursts, his fingers digging into the steering wheel. He turned the key. Nothing. The woman's wail had stopped. He looked up. She was standing directly in front of his car. Nathan's body locked up. His breath came in shallow gasps. The woman's eyes, if she had any, were hidden beneath the matted curtain of her hair, but he could feel her staring at him. Slowly, her head tilted further, further, until her neck bent at an impossible angle. A thick crack echoed in the stillness. Nathan's vision blurred. His head throbbed. His nose started to bleed. Then, a flash of movement in the mirror. Nathan's stomach turned to ice. The back seat. Something was in the back seat. He didn't turn. He couldn't. He felt it before he saw it. Breath against his ear, the faint rustling of something shifting behind him. His hands were shaking so badly they barely obeyed as he reached for the door handle. Slowly, carefully. The breath behind him grew heavier. Closer. Nathan yanked the door open and threw himself out of the car, scrambling onto the cracked pavement. He hit the ground hard, the impact jarring up his legs, but he forced himself to move. He didn't dare look back. He ran. His body screamed in protest, lungs burning, heart pounding like a war drum. The desert stretched endlessly before him, but he kept running, his mind a blur of fear and survival. Somewhere behind him he heard the car door creak open. Then footsteps. Not one set. Many. Nathan didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The sound of shuffling feet grew louder, closer, impossibly fast. Shadows flickered at the edges of his vision. His body begged him to look, but he knew. He knew if he did, it would be over. Then suddenly, headlights. Real ones. A pair of bright beams illuminated the road ahead, cutting through the darkness. A truck. Nathan stumbled toward it, waving frantically. The truck screeched to a stop, the driver, a burly man with a worn face, throwing open the door. "Jesus, son, what the hell are you doing out here?" Nathan collapsed against the side of the truck, gasping for breath. He tried to speak, to warn the man, but his throat felt raw, his voice broken. The driver frowned and glanced over Nathan's shoulder. "Nobody out there, kid. Just the desert." Nathan turned. The road was empty. His car was gone. The only thing left behind was a single footprint in the dirt. Long, too narrow, leading into the dark. The trucker shook his head, muttering something about heat exhaustion, but Nathan barely heard him. He didn't protest when the man helped him into the cab, didn't argue when they pulled away from that stretch of road. But as they drove, Nathan glanced in the side mirror. For just a second, just a flicker, he saw her again, standing in the road, staring after him. And this time, she was smiling.
Story number 3.
The last time anyone saw James Holloway, he was leaving a bar just outside of Charleston, South Carolina. It was late, the streets empty, save for the occasional car passing through. He had been drinking, not enough to be stumbling, but enough for his judgment to be a little off. When he walked outside, the cool autumn air hit him, sobering him up slightly. He wasn't supposed to be out that night. His girlfriend had asked him to come straight home after work, but he needed a drink, needed space. They had been arguing more and more, and tonight was no different. As he lit a cigarette and walked to his car, he decided to take the long way home, down a stretch of road that ran along the river. Less traffic, more time to clear his head. The first few miles were peaceful. The road was lined with towering trees, their branches arching over the asphalt like skeletal fingers. The only sound was the hum of his tires and the occasional chirp of crickets. He rolled down the window, letting the night air wash over him. Then he saw the woman. She was standing on the side of the road, her long dark hair tangled, her dress torn at the hem, barefoot. She wasn't hitchhiking, wasn't even waving him down, just standing there, staring into the trees. James slowed down instinctively, his headlights casting a pale glow over her. Something about her felt wrong. Her posture was too still, too stiff. Her arms hung at her sides like they didn't belong to her, and her face, it was turned just enough that he couldn't quite see it. A cold feeling settled in his gut. He considered stopping, asking if she needed help, but the unease creeping up his spine told him to keep driving. So he did. As he passed her, he glanced in his rearview mirror. She hadn't moved. James shook his head, gripping the wheel tighter. Maybe she was just lost. Maybe she was on something. Not his problem. A mile down the road, he exhaled, trying to shake the nerves. The trees were thinning now, opening up to the marshland that ran along the river. He turned up the radio, hoping for a distraction. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw her again, standing at the edge of the road, the same woman. James slammed on the brakes. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. He turned his head. Nothing. His breath hitched. No way. He had driven at least a mile. There was no possible way she could have gotten ahead of him. His hands trembled as he put the car back in drive, forcing himself forward. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just seeing things. Maybe it was another woman who just looked like her. But deep down he knew. He wasn't alone. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. His eyes flicked between the road and the mirror, his grip on the wheel tightening with every passing second. He was almost home. Just a few more turns and we miss. The radio cut to static. A sharp burst of white noise filled the car, making him jump. He reached for the dial, twisting it frantically, but the static only grew louder. Underneath it, he could hear something else. A whisper. His blood ran cold. He didn't want to listen. Didn't want to understand what it was saying. Then, a hand slammed against his window. James screamed. The car swerved violently as he instinctively jerked away. He barely managed to regain control, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His mind raced. That hand, thin, pale fingers, nails cracked and broken, had come from outside, but he was going 50 miles an hour. No one could have kept up with him. His entire body was shaking now. He pressed the gas pedal harder, his only thought, get home, get inside, lock the doors. The road blurred around him. The headlights carved a path through the darkness, but it felt like the night was closing in, swallowing everything outside the beam of his lights. Then, she was in the road, standing directly in his path. James barely had time to react before he swerved again, tires screeching as he veered off the asphalt. His car slammed into a ditch, the impact jolting him forward. Pain shot through his chest as the seatbelt locked, stealing the air from his lungs. Silence. For a moment, he just sat there, his mind struggling to catch up. His fingers dug into the steering wheel, his breath coming in shallow gulps. Then, a tap on the glass, his entire body locked up. Slowly, mechanically, he turned his head. She was standing right outside the driver's side window. This close, he could see her now. Her skin was sickly pale, almost gray, stretched too tightly over her bones. Her eyes, dark, hollow voids, bored into his, unblinking. Her lips were cracked, barely concealing teeth that looked too sharp, too wrong. She smiled. James let out a choked sob, scrambling to unbuckle his seatbelt. His fingers fumbled, desperate. Another tap. She raised her hand, her fingers curled, beckoning. No, 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 no. He forced his body into motion, reaching for the lock, but before he could move, the door unlatched. His breath stopped. He hadn't touched it. The door creaked open. James bolted. He threw himself out of the passenger side, stumbling into the damp grass. He didn't stop. He didn't look back. Branches tore at his arms as he ran, his feet sinking into the soft earth. The distant glow of his house, safety, was just ahead. If he could just get inside. A whisper in his ear. Come back. His stomach twisted. The voice wasn't coming from behind him. It was coming from inside him. His knees buckled. A sharp pain spread through his chest, like icy fingers wrapping around his heart. His vision blurred. The last thing he saw was the figure standing in front of him, too close. Smiling. The next morning, James Holloway's car was found abandoned on the side of the road. The driver's side door was open. The seat was soaked in mud, as if someone had climbed inside with filthy, dripping clothes. His keys were still in the ignition. But James Holloway was never seen again.
Story number 4.
It was a little after midnight when Ethan Lockwood saw the man on the side of the road. The highway was empty, nothing but dark asphalt stretching for miles in both directions. He had been driving for hours, the glow of his dashboard the only company he had. His eyelids were heavy, his mind numb from the monotony of the road. Then he saw the figure. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, just a trick of the headlights. But as he got closer, the man became clearer. Tall, too tall. His arms hung unnaturally long at his sides, the fingers almost reaching his knees. His clothes were old-fashioned, a faded suit that looked like it belonged to another century. But it was his face that made Ethan's stomach twist, or rather, the absence of one. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just smooth, pale skin stretched over a blank face. Ethan's breath hitched. His hands tightened on the wheel, every instinct in his body screaming at him to keep driving. But as he passed, the figure moved. Not like a person should. Not with the natural weight of muscle and bone. It shifted, bending unnaturally, its head tilting in an exaggerated, inhuman way. Ethan's foot pressed harder on the gas. His heart pounded as he checked the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the faceless man standing in the road. But there was nothing. Just the empty stretch of highway. He exhaled, forcing himself to relax. His nerves were shot, and he was too tired to think straight. He needed to find a motel, get some sleep. That's when the radio flickered on. Static. A loud burst of white noise filled the car, making him jump. He reached for the dial, twisting it, but the static didn't change. Then, beneath the crackling, he heard it. A whisper. At first it was faint, just a breath against the distortion. Then it grew louder. A voice, hollow and distorted, crawling through the speakers. Ethan. His stomach dropped. He jerked the dial again, but the whisper didn't stop. It was inside the static, inside the car. Ethan. His name, stretched out, unnatural. The hair on his arms stood up. He gritted his teeth, slamming his hand against the radio. The static cut out. Silence. Ethan's breath came in short, ragged bursts. He gripped the wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. Then, a shape in the road ahead. His heart leapt into his throat. The faceless man, standing in the center of the highway, directly in his path. Ethan's body acted before his brain did. He yanked the wheel to the right, tires screeching as the car veered off the road. The vehicle skidded into the dirt, finally coming to a jarring stop. His breath came in frantic gasps. He turned his head, expecting to see the figure standing by his window. But the road was empty. Nothing. Just the dark stretch of highway, the wind whispering through the trees. Ethan swallowed hard, his pulse thundering in his ears. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, trying to slow his breathing. Just drive. Get out of here. He turned the key. The engine sputtered. He turned it again. Nothing. His stomach twisted. This wasn't happening. His fingers trembled as he reached for his phone. No signal. No service. A sinking feeling settled in his gut. Then, a soft tap on the window. Ethan froze. His entire body went rigid, his hand still gripping the useless phone. The tap came again. Slow. Deliberate. He didn't want to look, didn't want to see what was outside. But something inside him, some terrible, gnawing curiosity, forced him to turn his head. At first, he didn't see anything, just the reflection of his own pale face in the window. Then, a shadow moved, right outside the glass. His breath caught, fingers pressed against the window. Long, thin, too many joints. Ethan's body locked up, the fingers dragged slowly down the glass, leaving streaks of something dark behind. Not condensation, not dirt. Something thicker, something wet. Blood. His stomach lurched. Then, from the corner of his eye, a shape in the back seat. His breath turned to ice. He didn't move, didn't blink. The air inside the car felt heavy, suffocating. Slowly, so slowly, his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. A face stared back at him. Not his own, not human. It was smooth and featureless, a blank slate where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. But somehow, it was staring at him. Ethan's breath hitched. He didn't move, didn't even dare to breathe. Then, a whisper, right next to his ear. "Let me in." His body reacted before his mind did. He lunged for the door handle, throwing himself out of the car. He hit the ground hard, gravel scraping against his palms, but he didn't care. He scrambled to his feet, his chest heaving. The car was silent. The inside was dark, empty. Ethan swallowed hard. No, it was there. It had been there. The wind howled through the trees, carrying a distant, hollow laugh. Something was watching him, not from the car, from the woods. The shadows shifted between the trees, tall, thin, moving in unnatural jerks like a puppet with its strings tangled. Ethan backed away. The laughter grew louder. Not one voice. Many. Too many. The whispers came next, crawling through the air, brushing against his skin like fingers. He turned and ran. Branches tore at his clothes as he sprinted down the empty road. His legs burned, his lungs ached, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He didn't dare look back. The whispers followed. The laughter. Then, the sound of footsteps, right behind him. Ethan choked on a sob, his body screaming for him to stop, to rest. But he knew. He knew. If he stopped, he wouldn't get back up. Up ahead, a light. A gas station. The first sign of life in miles. Ethan forced himself forward, pushing past the exhaustion, past the terror. He stumbled through the doors, the fluorescent lights burning his eyes. The cashier, a bored-looking man in his 40s, barely glanced up. "Help," Ethan gasped. "Please, something's out there." The cashier frowned. "What are you talking about?" Ethan turned, pointing toward the road. The night was still. No shadows, no figures, just the empty highway. His car was gone. His breath caught in his throat. The cashier gave him a strange look. "You okay, man?" Ethan didn't answer. He was staring at the glass door, at his reflection, but something was wrong. His face, his features, they were fading.
Story number 5.
David Mercer had been on the road for almost 12 hours when he decided to stop for the night. He wasn't in a rush, just a solo traveler exploring small towns, taking in the quiet, empty roads of rural America. The sign for the Pinewood Inn appeared just off the highway, its neon glow flickering in the darkness. It wasn't anything special, just a single-story roadside motel with faded paint and a parking lot full of potholes. But it would do. Inside the front office, a bell chimed as he stepped in. A woman with sunken eyes and a forced smile sat behind the desk. Her name tag read, Mary. "Just passing through?" she asked, her voice flat. "Yeah," David said. "One night." Mary didn't ask for ID. She didn't even check the computer. She just handed him a brass key labeled Room 6 and said, "Don't leave your door unlocked." David frowned. "Is there a security issue?" Mary stared at him for a moment before responding. "Just lock your door." He took the key and left. David parked his car and walked to his room. The door creaked as he unlocked it, the hinges dry and stiff. The room smelled like dust and something else, something stale like old sweat or damp fabric. Inside, the wallpaper was peeling, and the carpet had dark stains that had been there far too long. The bed was old, the mattress sunken in the middle. A single framed picture hung above the bed. It showed a family, father, mother, 2 children, posing in front of the very same motel. But their eyes had been scratched out. David shuddered and turned away. He locked the door, the deadbolt, the chain. Then he showered, hoping to shake off the unease that had settled in his bones. By the time he stepped out, steam filled the small bathroom. He wiped the mirror with his hand and stopped. For a split second, he thought he saw something standing behind him in the reflection. A shape. A person. He spun around, heart hammering. Nothing. Just the empty motel room. His breath came out shaky. Just his imagination. He needed sleep. The whispering. The first noise woke him up at exactly 3:12 a.m. It was faint. Just a whisper of sound. A rustling. David sat up, blinking against the darkness. The room was silent except for the low hum of the heater. Then, a shuffle, like footsteps, right outside his door. He held his breath. Maybe it was just another guest, someone coming in late. But then, a tap on the door. Soft. Deliberate. David's stomach twisted. He glanced at the clock. Tapping came again. He swallowed. "Who's there?" Silence. David slid out of bed, moving slowly toward the door. He peered through the peephole. No one. A chill crept up his spine. Then, the handle rattled. Someone was trying to get in. David stumbled back, heart hammering. He grabbed the nearest thing, his phone, and turned on the flashlight. "Go away," he shouted. Silence. Then a voice, right at the door. Low, croaking. "You didn't lock it." David's blood turned to ice. He checked the locks again, fingers trembling. The deadbolt was in place. The chain was on. The door was locked. And yet, the handle turned, and the door opened. The chain caught, stopping it from swinging wide, but through the small gap, David saw something. A pale gray hand, fingers too long, reaching in, scraping at the chain. David slammed the door shut and locked it again. Silence. Then, a laugh. Slow, breathy, right outside. Then, nothing. David didn't sleep the rest of the night. By sunrise, David had already packed his things. He just wanted to get out, but as he grabbed his keys, something stopped him. The picture above the bed. It had changed. The scratched-out family was gone. Instead, the frame now held a picture of him, standing in front of the motel. David's breath hitched. His mind raced. He had never taken a picture here. He had just arrived last night. His hands shook as he took the frame off the wall. The glass was dusty, the wooden edges worn. This wasn't new. It had always been here. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with something unseen. David bolted. He rushed out, barely stopping to return the key to the front desk. Mary was gone. The office was empty. By the time he reached his car, his hands were shaking so hard he fumbled the keys. He forced the engine to start and peeled out of the parking lot, his heart slamming against his ribs. In the rearview mirror, the Pinewood Inn grew smaller, and standing in front of room 6, a figure. Tall, gray, smiling. David didn't stop driving until he was miles away, but as he finally let out a breath, his phone buzzed. A notification, a new photo. With trembling fingers, he opened it. It was a picture of him, sleeping in room 6.
Story number 6.
Charlie Henderson hated driving through the countryside at night. The endless fields, the eerie quiet, the way the roads seemed to stretch on forever. It all felt wrong. But tonight, he had no choice. He was driving back home after visiting his parents in Kansas, and his GPS had rerouted him onto a lonely 2-lane highway surrounded by miles and miles of cornfields. The road was pitch black except for his headlights cutting through the darkness. He hadn't seen another car in over 30 minutes. Every so often, a gust of wind would make the tall corn stalks sway, the dry husks rustling like whispers in the dark. Charlie turned up the radio, trying to push away the unease creeping into his chest. Then he saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the cornfield. At first, he thought it was just a scarecrow, but as he got closer, his stomach dropped. It wasn't a scarecrow, it was a person. Tall, motionless, standing perfectly still between the rows of corn. His face was shadowed, his clothes tattered. He didn't wave, he didn't move, he just stared. Charlie gripped the wheel tighter. The sight sent an icy chill down his spine, but he told himself it was just some farmer or a drifter. Nothing to be scared of. He kept driving, but a mile down the road, he saw another figure, standing at the edge of the field, identical, tall, motionless. Charlie's pulse quickened. He glanced in the rearview mirror. The first figure was gone. His throat went dry. He stepped on the gas. The further he drove, the more figures appeared. Every few hundred feet, there was another and another, all of them standing just at the edge of the cornfield, all of them watching him. Charlie's hands were slick with sweat. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. He needed to get off this road. His eyes darted to the gas gauge. Half a tank. Enough to get to the next town. He pressed the pedal harder. But then, his radio cut to static. The sudden burst of white noise made him jump. He reached for the dial, trying to fix it, but it wouldn't change. Then, a voice. Low, crackling, whispering through the static. "Do not stop the car." Charlie's blood turned to ice. The voice was wrong. Too deep, too hollow. Then, his headlights flickered. The road ahead seemed to ripple like a mirage. His stomach twisted. The darkness outside his car felt heavier, pressing in. Then, the engine shuddered. Charlie's breath caught. No. The gas pedal stopped responding. The speedometer dropped. His car was dying. "Do not stop the car," the voice whispered again, but it was too late. The engine sputtered. The car rolled to a stop. Charlie's hands trembled as he tried to restart it. Click, click. Nothing. Silence. Then, a shuffle outside. Charlie's breath hitched. He turned his head. The cornfield was moving. The stalks were swaying, not with the wind, but with something else. Shapes, figures, walking toward him. His chest tightened. His heart pounded so hard it hurt. They were coming. Slow, deliberate, emerging from the rows of corn. Closer. Charlie locked his doors, his hands shaking. He fumbled for his phone. No service. Then, a tap on the window. Charlie froze. His body locked up. His breath came in short, panic bursts. Slowly, he turned his head. A face stared back at him. Not human. Its skin was stretched too tight, its eyes too big, its mouth split into a jagged grin. It mimicked his expression, tilting its head as if studying him. Charlie couldn't breathe. Then, it opened its mouth. No lips, just a gaping, dark hole. A sound came out. A low, distorted... Charlie's body reacted before his brain did. He lunged for the keys, twisting them desperately. The engine roared to life. His headlights flickered back on, and the figure was gone. Charlie slammed the gas pedal. The car screeched forward, tires spinning against the asphalt. His heart was hammering, his vision blurred with panic. He sped down the road, the cornfields blurring past him. But in the rearview mirror, the figures were still standing there, watching, motionless. And then one of them waved, a slow, deliberate motion. Charlie's stomach dropped, the road stretched ahead. He didn't stop, didn't slow down. He didn't dare look back again. The next town was 20 miles away. He just had to make it. But as he drove, his headlights flickered once more. and the voice on the radio whispered, "You shouldn't have stopped." The aftermath. Charlie never spoke about what happened that night. He made it to the next town, pulling into a gas station, pale and shaking. The clerk asked if he was okay. Charlie just nodded. But as he stepped out of his car, something caught his eye. A smudge. Something on his window. His stomach twisted as he leaned closer. A handprint. Not from the inside, from the outside. But the fingers were too long, too thin, not human. Charlie never drove through the countryside at night again. And he never, ever stopped near a cornfield.
Story number 7.
Elliot had heard the stories about the old Parker house since he was a kid. Everyone in town swore it was cursed. It sat at the edge of the woods, abandoned for decades, its windows dark and empty. No one lived there. No one ever should. The rumors said people who went inside never came back the same. Some never came back at all. But Elliot didn't believe in ghost stories, so when his best friend Mark dared him to spend the night there, he laughed and took the challenge. The first sign. He arrived at 10:45 p.m., flashlight in hand. The Parker house loomed before him, its peeling paint and rotting wood giving it a skeletal appearance. The front door was slightly ajar, swaying in the wind. As soon as he stepped inside, the air felt wrong. Heavy. Thick, like it was pressing against his skin. The floor creaked under his weight as he walked through the main hallway. Old furniture was covered in dust, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling like curtains. The smell of rotting wood and something else, something sour, filled his nose. Then he heard it. A voice. Soft. Distant. Calling his name. Elliot. He froze. His blood turned to ice. It was impossible. He was alone. The voice was coming from upstairs. Something deep in his gut told him to leave, but he had made a bet. So instead of running, he took a step forward. The upstairs hallway. The second floor was worse. The air was stifling, thick with a strange buzzing silence. The wooden floor beneath him felt softer, like something was shifting under it. The hallway stretched before him, doors lining each side. At the end of the hall, a single door was open, just a crack, and from inside, he heard it again. Elliot. His breath hitched. It was clearer this time, a woman's voice. Familiar. Too familiar. It sounded like his mother. But that was impossible. His mother had been dead for 3 years. His heart pounded as he stepped closer. He knew he shouldn't. He knew this was wrong. But the voice whispered again, "Come in." His shaking hand reached for the door. It creaked open. The room. The room was dark, except for the glow of the moonlight filtering through the broken window. There was nothing inside. Nothing except a single wooden chair. And sitting in that chair was his mother. His breath caught in his throat. No, this wasn't possible. She was gone. She had died in a car accident 3 years ago. He had seen the wreck. He had gone to her funeral, but here she was, wearing the same blue sweater she had worn the last time he saw her. Her head tilted slightly, her lips curled into a soft smile, her eyes wide and unblinking. "Elliot," she whispered. "Come here, sweetheart." His entire body screamed at him to run, but he couldn't move. Something about her smile was wrong. Too wide, too sharp. Her teeth, they were too long, too many. "Come here," she repeated. Her voice was off, hollow. Her jaw unhinged slightly as she spoke. Elliot took a step back. His flashlight flickered. For just a split second in the blinking light, he saw what she really was. Not his mother. Something else. Something wearing her face like a mask. Elliot stumbled back, his pulse hammering in his ears. The thing in the chair twitched. Its body shuddered, convulsing, its limbs jerking at unnatural angles. Then it stood up. Too fast, too smooth. Its legs didn't bend the right way. Elliot turned and ran. The house doesn't let you leave. He bolted down the hallway, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind him, footsteps followed. Fast. Inhumanly fast. The whispers surrounded him now, not just his mother's voice. Others. Many others. Calling his name. Laughing. "Elliot, come back." He reached the stairs. The floor shifted beneath his feet. He felt something move under the wood, something breathing beneath the house. He nearly tripped as he lunged for the front door. He grabbed the knob, twisted it. The door wouldn't open. His breath hitched. He yanked harder. The whispers were getting closer. Then a cold hand wrapped around his wrist. Long fingers. Too many joints. He screamed. The thing pulled him back. He saw its face. No longer his mother. A stretched, grinning thing with hollow black eyes. It whispered, voice dripping with something wet and dark, "You belong to the house now." The morning after. Elliot woke up in the front yard. The sun was rising, birds were chirping, the house was quiet. He sat up, his entire body aching. His clothes were torn, his hands were covered in dirt. For a moment he thought it had all been a nightmare. Then he saw it. The bruises around his wrist, shaped like fingers. He staggered to his feet, his stomach turning with nausea. His car was still parked where he had left it. Shaking, he climbed inside, turned the key. The engine roared to life. As he pulled away, he looked in the rearview mirror and froze. The house was closer to the road than before, like it had moved, and in the upstairs window, something was watching him, smiling. It waved. Elliot didn't stop driving until he was miles away, but when he got home, exhausted and shaken, he felt something in his pocket, a small piece of paper, with a message scrawled in his own handwriting where you can never leave.
Story number 8.
Lena had been living in her apartment for 3 months when she first noticed something was off. It started with small things. Her keys weren't where she left them. The milk in her fridge would sometimes be warmer than it should be, even though the fridge worked fine. She heard creaks at night, but she lived on the top floor, no one above her. She tried to brush it off. Old buildings made noise. She was just being paranoid. But then she heard breathing, not hers, not from inside her apartment, from inside the vents. Something is watching. Lena worked late hours. By the time she got home, the hallways of the apartment complex were always silent. That night, as she turned her key in the lock, she felt a prickle on the back of her neck, like she was being watched. She stepped inside quickly, locking the door behind her. The apartment was silent. She dropped her bag, kicked off her shoes, and walked to the kitchen. She opened the fridge and stopped. The light inside the fridge was already on, like someone had just closed it a second before she walked in. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She turned, scanning the room. Nothing. But something felt wrong. Then, a faint scratching sound coming from the air vent near the ceiling. She slowly lifted her gaze. The vent was dark, still, but she could feel something inside, watching. Her fingers hovered over her phone. She thought about calling someone, her mom, a friend, anyone, but what would she even say? Instead, she forced a laugh, shaking her head. "Get a grip, Lena," she muttered. She grabbed a glass of water and went to bed. She didn't sleep well. The first sight. The next morning, she was groggy. She got dressed, grabbed her bag, and was about to leave when she noticed something weird. The vent in the hallway? The screws were loose. Her stomach twisted. She hadn't touched the vent. Her hands shook as she tightened the screws back in. She left quickly, trying to push the thought away. But all day at work, she couldn't shake the feeling. By the time she got home, the sun had set and the apartment was quiet. Too quiet. She double-checked the vent. The screws were still in place. She let out a breath of relief. Maybe she really was just being paranoid. That night, she fell into a restless sleep. But sometime after 3 a.m., she woke up to a sound. A soft, metallic creak. Her heart pounded. She turned her head slowly toward the vent near the ceiling, and she saw it. A face. Pale, sunken eyes, pressed against the slats of the vent, staring down at her. Lena froze. Her mind screamed at her to move, to run, but she couldn't. Then the vent cover shifted. The screws she had tightened clinked to the floor. The cover slid open and a hand emerged, long fingers, too thin, too pale, reaching down toward her. Lena screamed. She lunged out of bed, her pulse a wild drum in her ears. She grabbed the lamp from her nightstand and hurled it at the vent. Crash! The thing in the vent recoiled, disappearing into the darkness. The sound of scrambling echoed through the vents, something crawling away, fast. She didn't stay to find out where it went. She ran. The police don't believe. By the time the cops arrived, the apartment was still. Lena was shaking, barely able to speak as she told them what she saw. They searched the vents, the whole building. Nothing. No signs of forced entry, one of the officers said. "You sure you weren't dreaming?" Lena's mouth went dry. She wasn't dreaming. She knew what she saw. But the look on their faces told her they didn't believe her. "Maybe you should stay with a friend for a few nights," the other cop suggested. She wanted to argue, but she was too tired, so she packed a bag and left. The footage. A week later, the building manager called her. They had checked the security cameras. He sounded shaken. "You should come see this," he said. Lena's stomach churned as she sat in the office, staring at the grainy black and white footage from the night she fled her apartment. At 3:28 a.m., her bedroom door opened. A tall, thin figure stepped out. From inside her apartment, Lena's blood went cold. The thing was human. A man. He was gaunt, his skin stretched over sharp bones, his clothes filthy, and he had been inside her walls. The footage showed him stepping out of her room, looking around. Then he crawled up the wall, that into the vent, like a spider. Lena covered her mouth, bile rising in her throat. The building manager was pale. "We think he's been living in the vents for months," he said. "We found a blanket, some food wrappers, and, He hesitated. "What?" Lena whispered. He swallowed. "We found pictures." Lena's skin crawled. The manager set a folder in front of her. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Dozens of photos. All of her. Sleeping, showering, eating. Some taken inches from her face. Lena's stomach twisted. "He was in my room," she whispered, "while I slept." The manager nodded grimly. "The cops are looking for him," he said. But Lena wasn't listening because something caught her eye. The last photo in the stack. It was taken after she left the apartment. After the police had searched it, a fresh picture, taken from inside the vent, with a single message scrawled in the corner, "I miss you." Lena moved out that night. They never caught the man, but sometimes late at night, when she's alone in her new apartment, she swears she hears scratching in the vents, and when she tries to sleep, she feels eyes on her.
Story number 9.
The motel off Highway 93 had a reputation. Locals called it the Whispering Pines, but truckers and travelers knew it as something else. The Last Stop. It sat on a forgotten stretch of road, just outside a small Arizona town. The neon sign flickered erratically, buzzing like an insect caught in a light trap. Rooms were cheap, too cheap, and people who stayed there often left with stories. Adam was on his way to California when exhaustion forced him to pull over. He'd been driving for 15 hours, eyes burning from the road. The motel was the only option for miles. He stepped inside the lobby, greeted by a middle-aged woman with dull eyes and a polite but distant smile. Her name tag read Marcy. "Just one night?" she asked. Adam nodded, sliding a 20 across the counter. The price was suspiciously low, but he was too tired to question it. "Room 6, she said, handing him a tarnished key. "No smoking, no guests. Or Friday, and if you hear anything at night, just ignore it." Adam frowned. "What kind of anything?" She hesitated. Her fingers tapped against the counter. "This place is old," she said finally. "It makes noises. That's all." Adam didn't push. He took his key and walked to his room. The hallway smelled like stale air and something faintly metallic. The carpet was worn thin, patches of it darker than others. He reached room 6, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of lemon cleaner, as if someone had desperately tried to scrub something away. The bedspread was an ugly shade of brown, and the walls were bare except for a single crooked painting of a forest. He locked the door, tossed his bag on the chair, and collapsed onto the bed. Sleep came fast. But something woke him a few hours later. A sound. A soft, rhythmic tapping. He blinked in the darkness, trying to orient himself. The room was still. The only light came from the neon glow seeping through the curtains. Tap, tap, tap. His breath caught. The sound was coming from the closet. Adam sat up slowly, heart hammering. He stared at the closet door, which was slightly ajar. He was sure it had been shut before. He reached for his phone, using the screen's glow to illuminate the room. Tap, 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 tap. "Hello?" Voice hoarse. No answer. Adam swung his legs off the bed, planting his feet on the cold floor, like his body tensed as he stood. Each step toward the closet felt heavier. He placed a hand on the door and pushed it open. Empty. Nothing but an old wooden hanger swaying slightly. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Losing it," he muttered. He shut the closet door firmly and turned back toward the bed. Then he saw it. The closet door had a mirror on the outside, and in the reflection something was standing behind him. Tall. Thin. Its face stretched into an unnatural grin, eyes hollow and black. Adam spun around. Nothing. His breathing was ragged. He turned back to the mirror. It was still there. Closer. Adam stumbled backward, his body slamming against the dresser. His hand fumbled for the lamp, switching it on. The thing in the mirror didn't move. It just watched. Its head tilted slowly, its smile widening. Adam bolted for the door, yanking it open and sprinting into the hallway. The motel was silent. Too silent. He ran to the lobby, breathless, slamming his hands on the counter. Marcy looked up, unsurprised. "Room 6, she murmured. Adam nodded, struggling to form words. She sighed. "It always chooses someone." Adam's skin prickled. "What the hell is in that room?" he demanded. She hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "Not in the room," she whispered. "In the mirror." Adam shook his head. "What does that mean?" Marcy's eyes flickered to something behind him. His stomach dropped. He turned slowly. The motel lobby had a mirror on the back wall, and in the reflection, standing just behind him, was the thing from his room. Grinning. Waiting. Adam didn't think. He bolted for his car, his only thought to get as far away as possible. He sped down the highway, the neon sign of the Whispering Pines growing smaller in his rearview mirror. But when he glanced at the mirror again, it was still there, in the back seat.